Marcus had practiced his response in the elevator ride up. He expected a messy homecoming, shattered Christmas, a throat-tearing scream, or the desperate, ugly bargaining Nia usually used to navigate his moods. He expected to find her broken in the middle of their obsidian-tiled living room, a casualty of the wealth he used to cage her. He was already laughing, his hand resting dominantly on Vanessa's waist as she leaned into him in that loud, chaotic red dress. But Nia didn't scream. She stood in the center of the penthouse, framed by the cold, 62nd floor skyline. She was a statue in dark silk, her hand rising slowly to rest flat against her sternum. It wasn't a gesture of grief. It was clinical, like a field medic checking for a pulse before declaring a time of death. Marcus felt his control slip as he met her glossy, steady eyes. He didn't notice the scent of expensive sandalwood or the shadow moving by the floor-to-ceiling glass. He didn't see Kang Minyi, the man he dismissed as a lowly associate, stepping out of the dark. Minyi's eyes weren't on the weeping wife. They were narrowed on Marcus, a silent predator waiting for the order to strike. In that hollow stillness, Marcus finally understood. Nia wasn't collapsing. She was deciding exactly how much of his world she was going to burn down. The penthouse was a cathedral of cold surfaces and expensive silence, but today, the air felt thick with the cloying scent of Vanessa's perfume. It was a floral, aggressive smell that didn't belong in the home Nia had spent years meticulously curating. Marcus stood by the obsidian kitchen island, swirling a glass of scotch, as if he had just won a merger rather than destroyed a marriage. On the velvet sofa, Vanessa sat with her legs crossed, her bright red dress a jagged wound against the neutral tones of the room. She was scrolling through her phone, occasionally casting a smirk toward the hallway where Nia was moving. "You're really going through with this?" Marcus's voice drifted down the hall, laced with a familiar, sharp-edged condescension. He appeared in the doorway of their master's suite, watching Nia pull a suitcase from the top of the walk-in closet. "Look at you, Nia. You're shaking. You can't even handle a suitcase without looking like you're about to shatter." Nia didn't look up. Her hands were indeed trembling, but it wasn't the tremor of fear Marcus thought it was. It was the vibration of a tectonic plate shifting. She reached for a stack of simple, dark-toned sweaters, folding them with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that bypassed the chaos in her chest. "You'll be back in 48 hours, Marcus continued, leaning against the doorframe. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes tracking her every movement with the predatory arrogance of a man who believed he owned the oxygen in the room. The world out there doesn't care about quiet strength or grounded resilience. It cares about status. It cares about the name Carter. Without my accounts, without this roof, you're just a ghost. You have nothing, Nia. You are nothing." Vanessa let out a light, tinkling laugh from the other room, the sound echoing off the floor-to-ceiling glass. "She'll probably end up back in that drafty apartment she came from," the mistress called out, her voice dripping with artificial pity. Nia paused, her hand resting flat against her sternum, feeling the steady, clinical beat of her heart. She thought of the shadow she had seen by the window, the calm, narrowed eyes of Kang Minyi. She thought of the way the air had seemed to bow to him. "I'm finished," Nia said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken since walking in, and her voice was a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. She zipped the suitcase closed with a sharp, final click. As she rolled it toward the door, she had to pass Marcus. He didn't move, forcing her to brush past his shoulder. He expected her to flinch. He expected the plea he had already rehearsed a refusal for. Instead, Nia looked him directly in the eye. Her glossy gaze was as steady as a mountain. She didn't say a word as she walked toward the elevator, leaving behind the glass house and the man who thought he was its king, unaware that the shadow following her out was the only true power he had ever encountered. The motel room was a far cry from the 62nd floor penthouse. Here, the air smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and old carpet, a hum of a flickering neon sign outside the window providing the only soundtrack to Nia's first night of freedom. She sat on the edge of the bolted-down bed, still wearing the dark silk blouse from the night before. Her hand remained pressed to her sternum, but the clinical beat of her heart was now accompanied by the heavy, echoing silence of the unknown. Marcus had sent 17 missed calls. They weren't apologies. They were digital tethers, desperate attempts to pull her back into the glass cage where he could control her breathing. Nia stared at the phone until the screen went black, reflecting her own steady, glossy eyes. A soft, deliberate knock at the door didn't startle her. It was too precise to be Marcus. When she opened it, the hallway light framed a silhouette that seemed to absorb the shadows around it. Kang Minyi stood there, his black tailored suit pristine despite the humidity of the night. Up close, without Marcus's arrogant bluster filling the room, the man's presence was suffocating. The intricate ink of the tattoo on his neck peeked above his collar, a dragon coiling into the dark, signaling a world Marcus was too blind to see. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, his movements possessing a predatory grace that made the small room feel like a throne room. He didn't look at the peeling wallpaper. He looked at Nia as if she were the only solid object in a world of ghosts. "He thinks you are hiding," Minyi said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that felt like a physical weight. "He is currently at the club, telling his associates that you will crawl back by dawn. He has already drafted the apology he expects you to recite." Nia leaned against the dresser, her posture firm. "And what do you think, Minyi?" "I think he has spent years trying to extinguish a fire he was never strong enough to light," Minyi replied. He stepped closer, stopping just outside her personal space. He didn't reach out to touch her. He didn't offer a shoulder to cry on or the hollow comfort Marcus used as a weapon. Instead, he reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a heavy, matte black card embossed with a gold serpent. He placed it on the dresser beside her suitcase. "Marcus has money, Nia, but I have the city," he said, his eyes narrowing with a lethal intensity. "I haven't spent 3 years watching you survive him just to see you walk away with nothing. My men are already moving. His accounts are being mapped. His secrets are being harvested." Nia looked from the card to the man. The secret admirer was gone, replaced by the viper. "Why?" "Because a queen shouldn't have to live in a motel," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching with a shadow of a smile. "I am not offering you a hug, Nia. I am offering you an army. Tell me to strike, and by tomorrow, Marcus Carter will realize that he was never the king. He was just the man holding your coat." The first tremor of the collapse didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like the polite, digital chime of a declined transaction. Marcus stood at the bar of his exclusive private club, the amber light reflecting off his expensive watch as he slid his black titanium card across the marble. He was mid-sentence, regaling a group of investors with a story of his own brilliance, when the bartender's expression shifted from deference to a strained, professional awkwardness. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. It seems there's an issue with the authorization." Marcus's jaw tightened, a flash of the temper Nia knew so well darkening his features. "Run it again. It's a glitch. My bank is probably flagging the unusual activity from the penthouse purchase." But it wasn't a glitch. By the third attempt, Marcus was snarling into his phone, his muscular frame packing the length of the lounge while his associates began to whisper behind his back. The arrogance that usually sat on him like a tailored suit was fraying at the seams. Every account, every offshore trust, every digital reservoir of his power was coming back with the same cold, systemic zero. It was as if his entire financial identity had been erased by a phantom. While Marcus fought the air, Nia sat in the back of a sleek, armored sedan parked 3 blocks away. The neon lights of the city streaked across the dark glass like fallen stars. Beside her, Minyi was a portrait of lethal stillness, his thumb tracing the dragon tattoo on his neck as he monitored a tablet. "He is calling his head of security now," Minyi murmured, his voice a low vibration in the quiet cabin. "He is going to try to find you. He thinks if he can corner you, he can force you to sign the emergency access papers." Nia watched her reflection in the window. The glossiness in her eyes had hardened into a mirror-like sheen. "He'll come to the motel," she said, her hand resting flat against her chest. "He won't get past the street corner," Minyi replied, finally looking at her. The intensity in his gaze was a shield, absolute and unyielding. "My men have formed a perimeter he doesn't have the clearance to see. He can scream at the sky all he wants, Nia, but he will never lay a hand on you again. To the world, Marcus Carter is still a billionaire. To me, he is a man who just ran out of time." Nia felt a strange, cold peace wash over her. For years, Marcus had used money to make her feel small. Now that money was vanishing like smoke in a storm. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the black card Minyi had given her. The first strike had landed, and for the first time in a decade, the silence was no longer hers to bear alone. It belonged to Marcus, and it was deafening. The rain began as a fine mist, turning the city into a blurred canvas of neon and charcoal. Inside the armored sedan, the air conditioning hummed with clinical precision, but Nia felt a sudden, sharp heat as Minyi leaned forward to adjust the display on the console. The movement caused his silk tie to shift, and for the first time, the dim amber light of the cabin fully illuminated the skin above his collar. It wasn't just a design, it was a statement. The tail of a dragon, inked in a black so deep it looked like a void, coiled upward from beneath his shirt, its scales intricately detailed and ancient. It wasn't the trendy, shallow art of the socialites Nia had met at Marcus's parties. This was a mark of lineage, a brand of a world that didn't ask for permission to exist. She watched the way the ink moved with the pulse in his neck, steady, rhythmic, and utterly unafraid. In that moment, the pieces of the last 3 years clicked into place with a terrifying finality. This man wasn't a bodyguard. He wasn't a silent observer or a mere admirer. He was the Viper, the legendary shadow who controlled the city's veins, the one man Marcus had spoken of in hushed, fearful tones during late-night business calls. The realization should have sent her running back into the rain, but as she looked at the mark, Nia felt a strange, jagged sense of recognition. "You're starring," Minyi said. He didn't pull away or try to hide the ink. He turned his head slightly, offering her a clearer view of the predator climbing toward his jawline. "Does the sight of it change your mind, Nia? Does it make you want to return to the man who thinks a red dress is a trophy?" Nia reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the dragon's scales. She could feel the dormant power radiating from him, a stark contrast to the hollow, frantic violence Marcus used to exert control. Marcus used fear because he was weak. Minyi used silence because he was absolute. "No," Nia whispered, her voice shedding its last layer of hesitation. She let her hand drop, but she didn't move away. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, matching his predatory stillness with her own grounded iron. "It makes me realize that Marcus was right about one thing. I was a ghost, but ghosts don't have to stay invisible." She met his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting the same lethal intensity as the dragon on his skin. She wasn't asking for protection anymore. She was claiming a seat at the table. "I don't want to be the woman you save, Minyi," she said, her hand pressing firmly against her sternum, no longer checking for a pulse, but feeling the fire beneath it. "I want to be the woman who stands beside you when you burn his world down." Minyi didn't smile, but a slow, dangerous warmth kindled in his eyes. He reached out and placed his hand over hers, not to lead her, but to acknowledge the new weight she carried. The pact was sealed in the dark. The military wife had died in the penthouse. The Queen of Shadows had just been born. The grand ballroom of the Obsidian Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and artificial smiles, a place where power was measured in the weight of one's jewels and the length of one's shadow. Marcus moved through the crowd like a man who still owned the air, his arm wrapped tightly around Vanessa. She was a loud, vibrant streak of red, her laughter cutting through the classical music with an edge that lacked refinement. Marcus was performing, projecting an image of unbothered dominance even as his phone vibrated incessantly, with alerts of collapsing subsidiaries and frozen assets. "She'll be here," Marcus muttered to Vanessa, his eyes darting toward the grand entrance. "She'll come crawling back tonight, begging for a seat at this table once she realizes she can't afford a hotel room." Then the music didn't stop, but the conversation did. A silence cascaded from the top of the marble staircase, a physical weight that pressed the breath out of the room. Nia stood at the landing, but she was no longer the woman who folded sweaters with trembling hands. She was draped in a gown of midnight velvet, so deep it seemed to drink the light of the chandeliers. It clung to her frame with the precision of armor, its minimalist lines projecting a sovereign authority that made Vanessa's bright red dress look like a desperate cry for attention. Beside her, Minyi was a silent, lethal monolith in a black tuxedo. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a vow, the dragon on his neck a hidden promise of the violence he would exert for her. Marcus's face contorted, his shock curdling into a familiar, abusive rage. He stepped forward, his voice a low hiss that he intended to shatter her. "Nia, where did you get that dress? Who did you rob to stand here? You're a ghost, remember? You're nothing without my..." He was cut off not by Nia, but by the movement of the room. The elder of the city's trade commission, a man Marcus had spent 3 years trying to impress, stepped past him as if he were made of glass. He didn't even glance at Marcus. Instead, he stopped before Nia and bowed his head in a gesture of profound, ancient respect. "Madam Carter," the elder murmured, his voice carrying through the quieted hall. "The Viper informed us of your arrival. The head table is yours." One by one, the titans of industry and the shadows of the underworld followed suit, parting like a dark sea. Marcus stood frozen, his hand still half raised in a gesture of dismissal that now looked pathetic. He was the billionaire, the man of the penthouse, but as Nia walked past him, her steady eyes never once dropping to meet his, he realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't the king of this gala. He was just a spectator watching his wife take the throne he never knew existed. Nia didn't look back. She simply walked into the light, leaving Marcus shivering in the cold wake of her new, absolute power. The security detail at Carter Global didn't even attempt to stop the men in black suits. Marcus watched from his office window, his chest tight with a frantic, pulsing heat as a fleet of obsidian sedans pulled into his private bay. He was waiting for his board of directors, the men he intended to bully into a bailout. But as the double doors to his executive boardroom swung open, the air in the room didn't just chill, it vanished. Marcus stood at the foot of the mahogany table, his jaw set in a snarl. "What is this? Where are my directors?" At the far end of the room, seated in the high-backed leather chair that Marcus reserved for himself, was Kang Minyi. He looked entirely at home, his posture relaxed but radiating a lethal gravity. He wasn't wearing the muted suit of a bodyguard today. He wore a charcoal wool three-piece that cost more than Marcus's first car, and for the first time he hadn't bothered to pull his collar high. The dragon on his neck was fully visible, its dark, coiling tail marking the jawline of a king. "They've been excused, Marcus," Minyi said. His voice was a low, melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate the glass walls of the office. "They realized that their shares were worth significantly more to me than they were to a man who can't even keep his own house in order." Marcus let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, though his hands were shaking behind his back. You're a hired hand, a shadow I let walk behind my wife because I was too busy to look at you. I'll have you blacklisted from every firm in the hemisphere." Minyi leaned forward, the light catching the narrowed, predatory focus in his eyes. He didn't look like an employee. He looked like the man who decided who lived and died in the city's concrete veins. "You never looked at me because you were too busy looking at your own reflection. If you had looked, you would have seen the Viper. You would have realized that while you were playing at being a billionaire, I was owning the banks that printed your money." The door opened again, and Nia stepped in. She didn't look at the furniture or the luxury she had once shared with Marcus. She walked directly to Minyi's side, her dark eyes steady and dry. She placed a hand on the back of his chair, not for support, but as a claim. "The lowly employee is the one who bought your debt this morning, Marcus," Nia said, her voice a calm, clinical edge that cut through his frantic ego. Marcus collapsed into a chair, the reality of the unmasking finally hollowing him out. The man he had looked down on was the apex predator of the city, and the wife he had dismissed as nothing was now the only person with the power to let him keep his name. Marcus looked at the dragon on Minyi's neck and finally felt the true weight of the silence he had mistaken for weakness. He wasn't losing a company. He was losing a war he hadn't even realized he was fighting. The boardroom felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago, the air thickening with the distinct, metallic scent of Marcus's mounting panic. He looked between Nia and Minyi, his gaze darting like a trapped animal's. The predatory stillness of the man in the chair and the icy, clinical composure of the woman beside him was a pincer move he hadn't prepared for. Marcus scrambled for the only weapon he had left, the memory of the woman Nia used to be. "Nia, listen to me," Marcus started, his voice cracking, shedding the polished baritone of the billionaire and replacing it with a frantic, high-pitched plea. He stepped toward her, his hands out in a gesture of feigned vulnerability. I know I've been difficult. I know the penthouse was a mistake. Vanessa was a mistake, but we built this together. You're the heart of this family. You're kind, Nia. You're the one who always sees the good in people, even when I couldn't. Nia watched him, her hand resting flat against her sternum. She felt the steady, unwavering thrum of her heart. Marcus was using the same tone he used after he'd spent a weekend disappearing. The tone of a man who believed kindness was a resource he could harvest whenever his own cruelty ran dry. You can't let him do this, Marcus whispered, his eyes welling with calculated tears as he looked at Minyi. He's a criminal, Nia. He's a monster. If you let him take the company, thousands of lives are ruined. For the sake of everything we were, talk to him. Tell him to stop. I'll make it up to you. I'll give you anything. Minyi didn't move. He didn't even look at Marcus. He kept his eyes on Nia, waiting for the verdict. He had offered her an army, but the final strike required her hand on the blade. Nia let out a breath that sounded like a weary laugh. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw not the powerful titan who had cowed her for a decade, but a hollow man trying to bargain with a currency he had already spent. You're right, Marcus, Nia said, her voice dropping to a low, final hum that silenced his rambling. I was kind. I was the person who stayed when I should have run. I was the person who found good in you when there was only rot. She stepped away from Minyi's chair, walking toward the window to look at the city she now shared with the Viper. But that woman didn't survive the penthouse. You killed her the moment you laughed while I stood there in the dark. You didn't just break a marriage, Marcus. You broke the only part of me that would have cared enough to save you. She turned back, her eyes as dry and steady as a desert. Minyi doesn't need my permission to finish this. He has my blessing. Marcus's face went gray as the desperate bargain disintegrated. The mercy he had counted on wasn't just gone. It had been replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like the grave. Nia didn't flinch as Minyi signaled his men to move in. She had finally realized that her mercy wasn't a weakness, it was a gift, and Marcus Carter was no longer worthy of receiving it. The rain outside the floor-to-ceiling glass had turned into a torrential downpour, mirroring the cold, systemic erasure of Marcus Carter's life. The boardroom felt like a sinking ship, the air growing thinner with every second Marcus stared at the digital foreclosure notices flooding his monitors. The empire he had built on the backs of others, the wealth he used as a blunt instrument of control, was dissolving into strings of red code. This isn't possible, Marcus whispered, his voice trembling as he scrolled through the liquidation of his primary holdings. I am the majority shareholder. I am the face of this city. You were the face of a shadow I chose to let play in the light, Minyi replied, standing slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority radiating from the dragon tattoo on his neck was enough to keep the room paralyzed. The heavy mahogany doors creaked open one last time, and Vanessa stepped in, her red dress now damp and wrinkled, her eyes wide with a different kind of fear. She wasn't looking at Marcus with desire anymore. She was looking at him as a liability. She clutched an expensive leather handbag, one Marcus had bought her with Nia's grocery money, and headed straight for the exit without a word. Vanessa, Marcus called out, a pathetic, reaching sound. She didn't stop. She didn't even look back. To a woman who chased the sun, Marcus was now nothing but a darkening eclipse. She vanished into the hallway, followed closely by two of Minyi's men who would ensure she left with exactly what she had brought into the marriage. Nothing. Nia watched the exit with a clinical detachment. She stood by the window, the city lights reflecting in her steady, dry eyes. She felt the weight of the silence she had carried for years finally lift, transferring its crushing mass onto Marcus's shoulders. You're not just broke, Marcus, Nia said, turning to face him. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which made the words cut deeper. The authorities are downstairs. They found the offshore accounts Minyi's team unearthed, the ones where you hid the funds you embezzled from the employee pension fund to pay for that penthouse. Marcus's face went a sickly shade of gray. He reached for his phone, but Minyi's hand moved with the speed of a striking viper, pinning the device to the table. You spent your life believing you were untouchable, Minyi murmured, leaning in until he was inches from Marcus's ear. But Nia was the only thing keeping you human. Without her, you are just a criminal who overplayed his hand. As the heavy tread of tactical boots echoed in the hallway, Marcus collapsed into his chair, a hollow shell of the man who had once laughed from the 62nd floor. Nia didn't wait to see the handcuffs. She walked toward the door, her head held high, the military wife, fully replaced by a woman who knew exactly what her silence was worth. Behind her, the empire didn't just fall. It vanished into the dark, leaving only the Viper and his queen to watch the ruins. The penthouse was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. The cloying scent of Vanessa's perfume had been scrubbed away, replaced by the crisp, ozonic smell of the rain hitting the glass and the faint, grounding aroma of Minyi's sandalwood. The sirens had long since faded into the city's pulse, carrying Marcus away to a cell that would feel much smaller than the 62nd floor. Nia stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, her hand resting against the cool surface. Below her, the city looked like a scattering of diamonds thrown across velvet, steel and light burning cold against a sky too dark for stars. For years, she had felt like a prisoner in this monument to Marcus's ego, a ghost haunting the halls of her own life. Now, the height didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a vantage point. A soft, measured step sounded behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was Minyi. His presence was a steady heat at her back, a shadow that no longer felt like a haunting, but a shield. He came to a stop beside her, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The dragon on his neck caught the dim light of the city, its scales shimmering as he turned his head to look at her. "The board has been cleared," Minyi said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "The keys to the holdings are yours. The men outside the door report only to you. Marcus is a memory the world is already forgetting." Nia finally let her hand drop from her sternum. The clinical pressure she had used to keep herself together for a decade was gone. She took a deep, steady breath, her dark eyes reflecting the vastness of the horizon. She wasn't the military wife waiting for orders, nor was she the victim of a billionaire's whims. "He called this place a golden cage," Nia whispered, her voice shedding its last layer of pain. "He thought the glass was there to show me what I couldn't have without him." Minyi stepped closer, his gaze anchored on her with an intensity that promised a new kind of world. "And now?" Nia turned her head, meeting the Viper's eyes with a dry, absolute steadying of her soul. She looked at the man who had seen her strength when she was invisible, and she saw her own power mirrored in his narrowed gaze. "Now," Nia said, a slow, dangerous grace settling over her features, "it's a fortress, and from up here I can finally see everything." Minyi didn't bow, but the inclination of his head was an acknowledgement of her sovereignty. They stood together at the edge of the world, two shadows forged in the dark, watching the city they now owned. The sun would rise soon, but Nia wasn't afraid of the light anymore. She was the queen of shadows, and the world beneath her was finally quiet.